thank you, all of you, for being here tonight. As I mentioned to several of you, this is my first in-person program since before the pandemic. I'm sort of still remembering how to do that. Where's the button? Where's the chat? But it's wonderful to be able to do this again, especially at Salmagundi Club, which is just such a wonderful institution that really embodies so much of what we love and seek to preserve and perpetuate about our neighborhoods, the rich history, the artistic tradition, which of course is what we're going to be talking about tonight. Before I get into my program, I just want to briefly say about village preservation that we are a nonprofit, neighborhood-based organization founded in 1980. We do about 75 to 80 public programs a year, almost all of which are free and open to the public. But it's basically the support of our members, which enables us to do that. So if you like what we do, I encourage you to join at whatever level is comfortable for you and get more involved in the work that we do, whether it's preservation advocacy or just learning about your neighborhood, supporting small businesses. It's all a part of what we try to do 365 days a year. So I also just want to say that tonight's program.
So sorry. So sorry.
One of the in-person things that I'm also remembering and getting used to again.
You found, unfortunately. Sorry.
So tonight's program is going to go for about an hour. As you can imagine, summarizing the artistic tradition in Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo cannot be done in an hour. This is a highly, highly subjective, selective, kind of glancing blow at some of the broader arcs that run through the history of these neighborhoods in terms of how they became such centers of the arts. I'm sure you will all have favorites or additional piece of information to add. This is, of course, part of an ongoing conversation and an ongoing part of what we do. But if you'll sort of indulge me to kind of share with you some of my own personal perspective on this, hopefully you'll get something out of it, and there'll be something in here that's illuminating for you. So, yeah. So here's a map from the 19th century of Lower Manhattan with the areas that we're talking about outlined: Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. This is before some of those streets kind of changed their composition to what they are today. But the question is, why did this band of Manhattan south of 14th Street become such a center of artistic activity beginning in the 19th century and intensifying even into the 20th century, although clearly by the mid-19th century and throughout the latter half of the 19th century, this was already the artistic center of New York. Next. Here's a view of the area from overhead, a more contemporary one. Certainly one of the things that you can see is that there is this sort of jumbled, idiosyncratic street pattern that is not reflected in other parts of the Manhattan grid. And that's certainly one of the contributing factors why people were uniquely drawn to this neighborhood with more of a sort of creative drawing outside of the lines mindset. Next. And, here are just some examples of what manifested this in Greenwich Village on these irregular streets, this incredibly charming architecture, these what I think for a long period of time seemed somewhat idiosyncratic and even a little bit outdated, but in the most charming of ways, types of architecture. Next slide. We see much of the same in the East Village as well, though the East Village more dramatically transformed in the 19th and 20th century due to the even greater waves of immigration that transformed the East Village as compared to the West Village, though both were dramatically impacted by that. Next, please. So here again, going back to this map, one of the interesting things to note about this area is that at a certain point in time in the early to mid 19th century, there were several streets in our neighborhood that were the most exclusive in all of New York. They were the most prestigious addresses anywhere in the city. And if you go to the next slide, I've sort of outlined them here. Believe it or not, 14th Street was once one of the premier addresses to live on. Lower Fifth Avenue connecting down to Washington Square certainly was as well. Second Avenue in the East Village, which decades later became famous as the Yiddish Rialto and a sort of working class entertainment district in the early 19th century, was one of the most prestigious addresses in New York with some of the grandest houses. Coming off of its St. Mark's Place between 2nd and 3rd Avenue also had some of the biggest, grandest houses in New York. And then just next to that, you also see what was at the time known as Lafayette Place, now Lafayette Street. It actually ended about a block and a half north of Houston Street. And it was only many decades later that it was extended all the way south, which was part of its transformation from this exclusive domain to this sort of broader through street that was reflective of its change. But Colonnade Row is, of course, the most telling remnant of its era of grandeur. So one of the things that we certainly see in terms of this area becoming a mecca for the arts is that, to a certain degree, as it's often the case almost anywhere, art follows money. But it often tends to follow money when money is starting to kind of move away. And there's an interesting relationship between these socioeconomic changes that you see in these neighborhoods and the arrival of artists, arts-related institutions, etc. So we go to the next slide. So here again, with those streets outlined, is this incredible constellation of institutions connected to the arts that surrounded this area in the mid-19th century. We see in some of the literature from the 19th century, Greenwich Village and what we today call NoHo in the East Village, of course, those terms didn't exist then, were considered the Athens of New York because of some of these great institutions that were located here that were meant to produce art, teach about art, engage the public on a variety of facets of literature, painting, performance, etc. So I'd actually like to go through each of these with you. So we can go to the next slide. So one of the very first, actually, was New York University, founded in 1831, but by then Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin. You probably know that name from NYU schools. NYU was intended to be merit-based and was non-denominational, unlike most American institutions of higher education at the time. Samuel F.B. Morse, a name which may sound familiar to some of you for other reasons, as the inventor of the telegraph, was the nation's first professor of painting and sculpture, beginning NYU's early focus on the arts as well as literature, making the school and the Washington Square area a mecca for artists and writers. And I don't think we can actually understate how important NYU's role, especially at this time, was in terms of centering Greenwich Village as a place of the arts. We could do an hour or more long program just on that, but just to sort of briefly summarize. Next. Then we have the Lenox Mansion, which was just up the block from here on 5th Avenue and 12th Street. The Lenox Mansion and Library was built by James Lenox, who was one of the richest men in New York, who owned dozens of acres on today's Upper East Side, now known as Lenox Hill. Lenox's mansion was the grandest of all of the many mansions rising in Lower Fifth Avenue. And just to be clear, Lower Fifth Avenue was the place to have a mansion in New York in the early 19th century, but this was the biggest of them all. But his mansion had the additional distinction, beyond being the biggest, of housing his personal and unrivaled book collection, which included the country's only Gutenberg Bible. The odd and reclusive Lenox would eventually build an actual library to house his collection on 5th Avenue and 70th Street in a grand structure which was eventually demolished to make way for what is today the Frick Collection, if you know the Frick. The Lenox Library eventually merged with the Astor Library and the Tilden Foundation to form today's New York Public Library. So here was this kind of odd, reclusive millionaire who had this mansion with this incredible collection of books that people were constantly trying to sort of get in and access. And he would allow it in this very kind of idiosyncratic, personal way of who could get in, who could access it. But it really did make his home, it gave it a place on the cultural map. Next, please. Then we have the Astor Place Opera House, which was built on Astor Place as New York's grandest venue for opera at a time when everyone from the very wealthy to the poor enjoy this art. The Astor Place Opera House was built at the edge of what was a wealthy district, but also near the more accessible entertainment area of the Bowery. But it was very much intended to focus on the upper class. In fact, the seating for the upper class was unusually generous, whereas for the lower classes, those who the cheap seats, so to speak, they were really, really isolated and made as unappealing as possible. There were very strict rules about how you could dress, how clean shaven you had to be, etc. So they were successful in terms of attracting the kind of people that they wanted, but it ended up creating significant tensions with the lower class would-be patrons who were also very much interested in opera, resulting in the infamous Astor Place riots or Opera House riots of 1849. I'm curious how many people here have heard of the Astor Place riots. Again, could be the subject of a whole other program. It actually left dozens of people dead and hundreds injured. And these were riots about who was the better opera performer. There was one who the upper class preferred, one who the lower class preferred. There was a sense of sort of being wrong, disrespected, etc. It's a very, very interesting story. So next up on the list, we have the National Academy of Design, which was founded in 1825 to promote the arts and architecture, and was the first institution in the United States established by and under the control of professional artists. Take for granted that sort of entity now. Called New York's most powerful arts group in the 19th century by Christopher Gray, it was founded by Samuel F. B. Morse, again, Astor Duran, Thomas Cole, and Ithiel Town, among others. By the way, I'll mention about Samuel Morse. On the one hand, he's an incredible Renaissance man, these great innovations in science and the arts. Also, a complete and utter bigot, proponent of slavery, anti-Catholic bigot. He actually ran for mayor of New York on this sort of know-nothing anti-immigration ticket. In sort of today's alignment of thinking, it's hard to imagine these components all being in the same person, but he very much embodied it. So he has quite the mixed legacy, to say the least. Almost every important or well-known artist in the city and those who aspired to be were members of the National Academy of Design. In 1848, they were located at 663 Broadway, which is the 5-story building on the left-hand side in the left-hand picture. That building has been demolished. But from 1854 to 1865, they were headquartered at 58 East 13th Street, which is still very much extant. That building exists just west of Broadway on 13th Street. Next, please. So next we have the Academy of Music, which was located at 14th Street and Irving Place, and was a 4,000-seat opera house, which supplanted the Astor Place Opera House as the center of social life for New York's elite after the deadly Astor Place riots. The building was destroyed by fire in 1866 and then rebuilt, and it remained the city's premier opera house until the opening of the Metropolitan Opera House uptown in what we would today call the Garment District, but which at the time was a sort of grand up-and-coming neighborhood in 1833. After which the Academy of Music became a vaudeville house as 14th Street transformed. 14th Street underwent this incredible arc from being where the grandest mansions in New York were, to a lot of very prestigious institutions that were located on 14th Street, to a high-end shopping district, to a less high-end, more middle-class shopping and entertainment district, to eventually, by the turn of the 20th century, what was called the poor man's Fifth Avenue. It was a place where the average New Yorker came to shop, to be entertained, to see Nickelodeons, etc. So really, really a sort of dramatic. And I would say that 14th Street in a lot of ways embodies what was, I believe, one of the key elements to why these neighborhoods became such a mecca for artists, because they had that entire panoply of the sort of human experience. Even in the times when they were least prestigious, there were still sort of the vestiges of this kind of old elite of New York, even as the neighborhood was filling up with immigrants, working class folks, people from all corners of Europe and other parts of the world. So it really was this place where you could experience elements of life that you could not anywhere else. There were certainly other immigrant districts in New York, but few that had this broad range from the sort of upper end to the lower end of the economic spectrum and everything in between all in one place. So just finishing off with this, if you could just go back in. So the Academy of Music was demolished in 1926 for the Con Edison building, which still stands there today. And another Academy of Music, which you may have heard of, was built across the street on the south side of 14th Street. And in spite of its name, it was a movie theater, which would eventually become the Palladium, which many of us remember, which was itself demolished to make way for NYU's Palladium dorm. It's interesting how some of these stories intersect. So next we have the Astor Library, which was established in 1848 as a private reference or non-circulating library open to the public. And just to give you context, there was no such thing, at least in New York, as a public library at this time. So the only way you had access to books was through these private library systems. Some of them were, and almost all of them until the latter part of the 19th century, just before the NYPL is established in 1895, most of them were, you had to pay to be a member. The first private but free public library came about in the late 19th century, also in this neighborhood, the New York Free Circulating Library, which the NYPL also basically absorbed. But this was it at the time. The Astor Library, established in 1848, was founded by German-born American fur merchant and real estate tycoon John Jacob Astor. It was originally located in a house at 32 Bond Street in NoHo, long since demolished. But that was a temporary location while a grand home was built for the library on the east side of what was then known as Lafayette Place, as we mentioned before, now Lafayette Street. So this was right across the street from the incredibly grand houses of Colonnade Row, of which at the time there were more than twice as many as there are now. Most of them were demolished over 100 years ago. So this jumps out the Astor Place. The Astor Library opened in 1854 at this location with 80,000 volumes, and the great writer Washington Irving was its superintendent. The library grew rapidly, with one extension added to the north of the building in 1859 and a second in 1881. So let me just show you here if this works. So this was the original building here in the middle, and these were the additions that came later on either side. Okay, so by 1890, the private library had over 250,000 volumes and was by far the largest in the New York metropolitan area. In 1895, the Astor Library merged with the Lenox Library, which we discussed before, and the Tilden Foundation to form today's New York Public Library. The former Astor Library then served as the NYPL's main branch until a new, even larger main branch was built at 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue, which we all know. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, this building then was taken over by something called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was reflective of the fact that these neighborhoods had become overwhelmingly immigrant. So it was an immigrant service organization. And then it was empty for many years, and it was slated to be demolished before Joe Papp and the Public Theater were successfully able to save it and take it over. So next up, speaking of libraries, we have the New York Society Library, which was founded in 1854. So now it was at the time numbered 67 University Place. It's what would now be 109 University Place. So University Place and around 11th Street on the east side of the street. It was founded in 1754, and it's the city's oldest library. It was originally housed in what was New York's first city hall, way in the suburbs of Manhattan, older than the city hall we now have, which is pretty old. Which eventually became Federal Hall. So if you know Federal Hall on Wall Street, that's where it was, although that is a replacement for the prior Federal Hall and City Hall that had been located there. The building the original library actually witnessed the inauguration of George Washington as our nation's first president, which took place at Federal Hall, and even lent him a few books, which apparently he was extremely tardy with returning. The library has located in many places over the years, but spent 81 years, beginning in 1856, in Greenwich Village, when it was this Athens of America, where everyone from Herman Melville to Willa Cather utilized its resources. With the establishment and expansion of New York's free public library system in the late 19th century, the role of private libraries like the New York Society Library changed. In the 1930s, it moved into a former mansion on the Upper East Side, where it remains today. Next, we have the New York Historical Society, which I'm guessing a few of you know, used to be located in the East Village. It was established in 1804 as New York's very first museum. And until the establishment of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it was the city's premier museum and the only one really taken seriously on the national stage. After being located in several temporary and leased homes further south, in 1857, the Historical Society completed its first permanent and purpose-built home on 2nd Avenue and 11th Street. This is really impressive. That fence you see over there on the right, that's St. Mark's Church. So it's on the east side of 2nd Street. And the construction of this building, where they remained until 1908, was largely funded by the social elite of the local neighborhood, even as they really didn't realize this at the time, but they were building this as the neighborhood was starting to dramatically transform from this kind of elite area to what came to be known as Klein Deutschland. It was the largest German-speaking immigrant community outside of Berlin and Vienna. So lots and lots and lots of recent working-class poor immigrants to the neighborhood. And that's probably part of the reason why in 1908 they moved to their current Central Park West home, not realizing that the East Village would again transform into a different kind of center of the arts. But that's just the story of the churn and change of New York. So next up, we have what is probably the single building that is most responsible for turning Greenwich Village into a mecca of the arts. And that is the 10th Street Studios, which was located on 10th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues on the north side of the street. Sadly, no longer with us. It was demolished a few years before the Landmarks Law, in the late 1950s, before the Landmarks Law came into effect. It was the first modern building designed to serve as studios for artists. Now, we take for granted this idea of what a studio is for artists, but this was actually a very new idea at the time. And certainly the idea of building such a space for artists was, at least in America, practically unheard of. So hundreds of prominent American artists used the space there, which became the center of the American art world in the 19th century. It also housed the first architectural school in the United States. Winslow Homer, Khalil Gibran, John Lafarge, Alexander Calder, and virtually every member of the Hudson River School of Artists took up residency here, with many of their most impressive works actually made within its walls. By the way, what was exceptional about this building, in addition to that, it created spaces that were meant to be a space that an artist could work in wide open, lots of light, big windows, etc. It was meant to be an artist's colony. So it was meant to be a place where you could have these multiple studios all arrayed around a central space where the artists could interact, learn from each other, see each other's work, etc. So George B. Post and Frank Furness were among the artists who trained here. It also greatly influenced the founding of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which we'll get to in a moment. So its reverberations were felt for generations after. Next up, we have Cooper Union, founded in 1859, the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. Soon after its founding, it became a mecca for progressive thought and discussion, as well as a premier educational institution focused on the arts, design, and the sciences. It was free and open to the public without barrier based on gender or race. The fact that it was free, the fact that you could matriculate if you were a woman, the fact that you could matriculate if you were Black, or regardless of race, was incredibly, incredibly rad. And representative of Peter Cooper's philosophy about education in general. He's a very progressive thinker in a variety of ways. It became a launching pad and training ground for many of the great artists and designers of the late 19th and 20th centuries, without a doubt, well into the 21st, as well as a frequent meeting spot for activists and advocacy groups. Among the many incredible moments in history which took place here, Lincoln's speech in the 1860s, shortly after it was founded, the first meeting of the NAACP in 1909, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the Cooper Union. Next is someplace which might be somewhat familiar, the Salmagundi Club, which was organized in 1871 for the, quote, promotion of social intercourse among artists and the advancement of the art. and was named for the Salmagundi Papers, a satirical magazine published by short story writer Washington Irving, in which he coined the term Goth. The club purchased this grand building built in the early 1850s in the Italianate style in 1917. So they were, prior to this, they were located at a few different locations on Broadway and some other spots. So in this general area, this didn't become their permanent home until 1917. And by the way, that was very much reflective of the fact that by 1917, this part of Lower Fifth Avenue was certainly no longer a place where people were living in mansions, where the elite were living. Soon after, you would start to have a wave of apartment building construction here, and some of them very, very, very fancy ones. But this was emblematic that the sort of mansion era was over on Lower Fifth Avenue. But it was an elite institution which brought artists in. And so again, you see this kind of cross-pollination between the movement of money and the arrival of the artists. Notable members of the club include illustrators Edwin Abbey, N.C. Wyeth, and Howard Pyle, the Impressionist painter William Merritt Chase, arts and crafts pioneer John Lafarge, designer Louis Tiffany, and Hudson River School artist Thomas Moran, and architect Stanford White. So next, we have the Douglas Kruger Mansion, an example of one of these mansions that used to be located on 14th Street. Now, interestingly, does anyone know what is on the site where this mansion used to be?
Where is it?
The Salvation Army headquarters on 14th Street west of 6th Avenue. So it's, again, an interesting evolution here. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art is by far the largest and most prestigious museum in New York and the nation. It was officially chartered by an act of incorporation of the New York State Legislature on April 13th, 1870, for, quote, for the purpose of establishing and maintaining a museum and library of art, of encouraging and developing the study of fine arts. City and state fathers decided it was time for New York, and indeed for America, to have a museum of art that would rival those of Europe. While it was always intended to have a permanent home in Central Park, it took some time to build one. And the museum's largest and final home before that was in a former mansion, one of New York's grandest, on 14th Street west of 6th Avenue. By the way, after they moved out, or not long after they moved out, the Salvation Army did move in. And they occupied the building, and then eventually they tore it down and built a much, much larger building, which is there today. It should be noted that many of the men behind the establishment of the Met were members of Greenwich Village's social elite, such as John Jay II, who lived on Washington Square North, and the man who was most responsible for planning and designing the institution, Richard Morris Hunt, was also the designer of the 10th Street Studios and based many of his ideas for this new Metropolitan Museum based on his experience with the 10th Street Studios. So then last but not least, we have at the latter part of the 19th century, the House of Genius at 61 Washington Square South. Now, this was originally a grand single-family residence, which in 1886 was converted by a Swiss immigrant named Madame Branchard to a boarding house for writers, artists, and musicians. Some of the more notable residents included Willie Adler, Stephen Crane, Frank Norris, and Alan Seeger. But even after Branchard's death in 1937, it remained a mecca for bohemians and artists. But by 1948, over vociferous protests, it was demolished, making way for what would be NYU's Student Center, which was then later demolished to make way for another institution. So if I could ask you, could you just scroll back to the beginning where we show all of them on the map? Now that you've sort of seen each of them. So you can see there's just this incredible constellation in the 19th century of these institutions, which again sort of tended to follow. First, the neighborhood became the most elite address in the city, and then it sort of started to flip a little bit. And these cultural institutions kind of came in and sort of took advantage of that slippage, while there was still this incredibly vital combination of money, but also, the poor, the middle class, the well-to-do, all mixing in this one place. So if you can go back through those. So we're going to take a sort of a couple of different slices at the area. So these are among the many artistic movements that were rooted in this neighborhood. The Ashcan School, For those of you who are sort of familiar with that, we'll look at some of their examples. The 14th Street School, obviously named for 14th Street. The New York School, which probably more than any other, along with the abstract expressionists, which sort of overlaps, was really responsible for this area, for New York and for America, becoming not only the center of the national art world, but the international art world. Pop art, minimalism, neo-expressionism, all deeply, deeply rooted in this neighborhood. So what I'd like to do is actually show you some examples, particularly ones that kind of played off of or drew in a very specific and clear way on the area. But first, we have this event, which took place in 1917, which is in some ways really kind of emblematic of this area's sort of self-conscious emergence as the kind of capital of the arts. And that was in January of 1917, when the artists Frederick Ellis, Marcel Duchamp, Bertram Drick, Alan Russell Mann, Betty Turner, and John Sloan climbed to the top of the Washington Square Arch, when you could still do that, had a few drinks, and decided to declare the independent Republic of Washington Square. Next, please. So here's just sort of a few examples, all within footsteps of where we are now. This little house at 11 East 12th Street in the late 19th century was the home of the artist J. Alden Weir, who was the one of the premier American Impressionist painters. Next, please. Of course, just around the corner on 8th Street, we have what was the Whitney Museum. It's now the New York Studio School, so all the new sort of generation of artistic significance there. And if you've ever seen it, it's incredible. It's still there in the New York Studio School. This carved fireplace within the building by Robert Winthrop Chandler. So it was not only a place where art was made and displayed, but where some of it still very much exists in the building. And the Whitney Museum of American Art, by the way, is notable for many reasons, but it was the first museum to focus exclusively on American art, when the idea of focusing on American art was really seemed crazy. American art as sort of legitimate or worthy of individual focus. The thinking was, if you go back one slide, that somebody like Weir could maybe do what the Europeans were doing, comparable to what they did. But if you could move forward, but the Whitney really wanted to focus on what Americans were uniquely doing, not simply imitating or following the footsteps of Europeans. Next, please. Example, Paul Katniss, who lived both at 54 Morton and 5 St. Luke's Place. The painting down there at the bottom is called Greenwich Village Cafeteria. It was, I believe, the building that's on Sheridan Square, that sort of yellow and black brick building. That's where the scene takes place. Next, please. So then, about 50 years later, the same building became home to Reginald Marsh of the 14th Street School of Artists. So now we go from J. Alden Weir, a great artist, but an artist very much following the European tradition, albeit with some, kind of American distinctive elements to it, to this very distinctly New York, local American School of Art, which is the 14th Street School, which was meant to focus on the working class, the average person, the new industrial city, the changing mores around men and women, etc. So he, while living here as well as around the corner on 11th Street, painted a series of paintings, all of which are very much about 14th Street. Here's in 14th Street from 1934. Next. End of the 14th Street crosstown line, 1936. Next. Just plain old 14th Street, 1927. And subway 14th Street. And if you look closely, you can still see some of the elements in these paintings are still there. Others have changed. But it really is about the sort of the hurly-burly of the kind of the average New Yorker's life, and especially engaging in things like mass transit. And if you go back one, shopping at Tom McCann's, walking past vaudeville houses, etc. So one more. Great. Forward more, sorry. Great, and one more. Great, and here we have 14th Street subway. So again, more of that. Next, please. Then we have John Sloan, who was the kind of the embodiment of what came to be known as the Ashcan School. He lived at 240 West 4th Street, 61 Paris Street, and he had his studio at 2 Cornelia Street. All of these buildings still extant, and he very much drew on his surroundings in his art, which we'll see in the next slide. So first of all, that, which on the upper left, that is 2 Cornelia Street. On the upper right, that's when the 6th Avenue L was still running overhead, and when 6th Avenue had not yet been cut. It ended at 3rd Street, so it had not yet been cut through, which is why it turns the way that it did. And we see the 6th Avenue L looking up, but that's at the bend at 3rd Street, looking out towards what's now Jefferson Market Library on the left. Next, please. Here's yet another image of the Jefferson Market Library and the subway. And then we have McSorley's over there on the right. It hasn't changed all that much. Next. And here we have backyards, Greenwich Village. So Sloan, and that was part of the ethos of a lot of these artistic movements of the area, which was to look at what was around you, to find the sort of the beauty and the depth in everyday life and everyday people. Next, and certainly we see that illustrated in Edward Hopper, who of course lived on Washington Square North until his death in 1967. Although, as I understand, NYU, which owned the building, we kept trying to push him out, but they were not able to do that. So just go back. We have Washington Square rooftops, so that very much visible from where his studio was. Next. Here we have early Sunday mornings. Now, Hopper played a lot of games with, his paintings, and he tried to make them not exactly like the subjects, but there is a remarkable similarity between that building and this building here, 233 Bleecker Street at Carmine Street. If you go to our website, a member of our board, Linda Yoel, did an incredible analysis looking at some images from the time, even the sunken fire hydrant and the barber pole is visible in images from the time. So we're fairly sure that what he painted was more or less a flattened, two-dimensionalized version of this building here. Next. And then we have a drugstore, which was clearly based on 154 West 10th Street, where Three Lives bookstore is. If you look closely, everything is exactly the same. Next. And then, of course, there's the iconic Night Box, which most scholars believe was based on a diner which is no longer there, but which was just south of Mulberry Square. And this building here, 70 Greenwich Avenue, is probably the building in the background behind it over there. So these were impressionistic takes on what he was really seeing in the world around him. And of course, he did other kinds of paintings in New England and elsewhere that were often more direct, directly showing in game toward the Sahara. Next, please. The Sheridan Theater, which of course was located on Greenwich Avenue in what later became the sort of St. Vincent's Mechanical Triangle, and is now St. Vincent's Park and the New York City AIDS Memorial. Next. So moving on, we have William Steig, who lived at 75.5 Bedford Street, the narrowest house in Greenwich Village. It's perhaps not surprising that somebody who was such a fanciful cartoonist would have lived in a house that seems like it's out of a cartoon. His most famous work, although he was doing cartoon work for the New Yorker for many decades, Shrek, he didn't actually do until he was in his 80s. So long after he was out of 75.5 Bedford Street, but while he was there, he was very successfully writing and working for the New Yorker. Next. Then we have Marcel Duchamp, who people are often surprised to know how strongly connected to this neighborhood he was. But if you go to the next slide, he lived at 28 West 10th Street, and he maintained a studio at what was the old St. Denis Hotel, recently demolished, sadly, at 799 Broadway, replaced with the lovely structure on the right. And that's a picture of many of us protesting the impending demolition in 2018, I believe that was 2019. Unfortunately, we're not able to save the building, but the building was when it was a hotel, and then in later years when it was converted into offices, it remained very much connected to the artistic life and the sort of social activism life of the neighborhood. And in fact, when Duchamp died in '67, he'd been working on this crazy art project, which was found in his studio. Uncompleted, and in later years, artists sort of basically put it together and allowed the public to see it, which had never been seen before. Next, please. We have Bernice Abbott, who lived at 50 Commerce Street, of course, a transformational photographer. And if you go to the next slide, you can see some of the images that she took of the neighborhood, everything from Astor Street in the upper right, the Jefferson Market in the lower middle, the house on the corner of Grove and Bedford. I believe that's Patchen Place in the upper left, and in the upper center, the lower right is I believe Gay Street, and the upper center are the buildings that were replaced by PS41. If I'm not, it's either they look very similar. There are these two rows of houses with verandas. That one was replaced by PS41, the other one was replaced by the O'Toole building. What's now the North Shore, what used to be St. Vincent's, the church of one piece that's still standing. So I forget which of the two that is. But next, please. Here we have at 88 East 10th Street. And this was interesting. Selma Hortense was this African-American sculptress who was active from the early to actually through the mid 20th century. Here, while she was living at 88 East 10th Street, which was between 3rd and 4th Avenues, which a couple of decades later would become the center of the art world, the 10th Street Gallery scene. She was there well before that. This was when she sculpted this image of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which eventually became the model that was used for the dime, where we see FDR every day today. Next, please. Yun Chi, who was this great modernist painter, who is the very, very first Chinese or Chinese-American painter to gain any kind of international acclaim. First to have a showing at the Museum of Modern Art, first to have a show in Paris, etc. He lived at 51 East 10th Street, which is just west of Broadway. And here are a couple of his paintings, next slide, that illustrate this is the Wanamaker fire in 1956 when the Wanamaker department store burned down, which was eventually replaced by Stewart House on 4th Avenue and Broadway. And down here in the lower right is what he called Old Broadway in winter, which really is Broadway around 12th or 13th Street, just around the corner from his home, looking north through Union Square to the Empire State Building and the MetLife Tower. Next, please. Liberal interpretation here of artists, getting into the sort of literature a little bit, but E. Cummings, who of course lived on Patchen Place, and he also drew on his surroundings in his art. If you go to the next slide, please. So this was one of his very, very first and in many ways most famous poems that he wrote before he was really a published poet, when he was working for Collier's in their printing house. He was just working, like I think, kind of loading pallets and things like that. But he wrote his famous poem, Buffalo Bill's Defunct, which it's been conjectured that working in this printing house and seeing the sort of topography and its inner workings influenced his own incredibly innovative use of language and topography as a way of communicating ideas. And next, please. And then, of course, his famous poem, Plato Told Him, where he references the 6th Avenue L, which was right outside of his home and was in the process of being dismantled while he worked there. And he references that in that poem as well. And then next, one of his last poems, one winter afternoon, at the magical hour when is becomes if, a bespangled clown standing on 8th Street handed me a flower. And he sort of talked about this kind of supernatural event, which takes place again just around the corner from where he lived on Patchen Place. Next. And so then we have Jackson Pollock, who was sort of the beginning of this wave of artists that really transformed New York into the center of the art world. And Pollock lived literally all over the neighborhood. Next, please. He lived at 46 Carmine Street for a while, 47 Horatio, next, and 49 East 10th Street, also for a little while as well. This was before he was a famous artist, and in fact, he may have just been using it as more or less a crash pad. Next, please. Just around the corner from there at 61 4th Avenue, we have Robert Indiana, who was lived there in the 1950s. And then by an interesting coincidence, next please, he was followed by Robert Motherwell, who also lived there a little bit later in the 1960s at the same building, still next to 61 4th Avenue. Next, please. Then we have Jane Freilacher, who sort of came from this New York school, but developed her own very distinctive painting style. She lived literally around the corner from here at 51 Fifth Avenue. At the far left, you see one of the examples. She lived at the top of the building with stupendous views, which often inspired her work. One example is early New York evening. It says far left, it should say far right. My apologies, but that's basically the view from her perch at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 12th Street. You can see Salmagundi in the right-hand corner of the picture. Next, please. Robert Rauschenberg, who converted what was an old convent on Lafayette Street, very much still there next to the parking lot, into his studios, and it's now the Rauschenberg Foundation. Next, please. And then, of course, Roy Lichtenstein. So now we're getting into the pop art era. His studios were at 745 Washington Street, and the foundation and his wife, his widow Dorothy, just recently gave the building to the Whitney Museum. You might have all heard about it. So the sort of the cycle of artistic life continues. Next, please. We have Lorraine Hansberry, who lived both on Bleecker Street and just off of Washington Square in this house at 112 Waverly Place. We're very proud to be able to put a plaque on her house a couple of years ago. Next, please. And then, of course, James Baldwin, who lived on Horatio Street as well. Both of them, actually, Hansberry, again, this could be an entire program. Baldwin certainly directly drew upon his experience in Greenwich Village and informed part of what he wrote. Hansberry, of course, people are often surprised to know that she lived in New York or Greenwich Village, which is so strongly associated with Chicago, where she was from, but she very much made a life for herself here. In fact, that home where she lived until she died at the very early age of, I think, 33 in 1965, she bought with the proceeds from raising the son. Next, please. So years later, after Selma Hortense Burke lived there, Willem de Kooning moved into 88 East 10th Street and helped transform that block of 10th Street into the 10th Street gallery scene that it became, which really was in a lot of ways the center of the art world in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And one of his paintings reflected that backyard on 10th Street. Next, please. He then moved to 827, 831 Broadway, also just around the corner from here. Two buildings that we managed to save from demolition. They were planned to be replaced by a 300-foot tall office tower a few years ago. That is a picture of him by Fred McDonough in his studio at 827 Broadway. Next, please. Elaine de Kooning also lived there with him and painted John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1963 while she was there. And a whole huge array of painters lived in this building. It was a little unofficial artist colony. Jules Olitsky, among many others, lived there. I believe Larry Rivers, whole host of folks. Next, please. Then we have Romare Bearden and the Spiral Group, as it was called, which was this collective of African-American artists in the mid 20th century. Bearden is, of course, most closely associated with Harlem, which is where he grew up. But the Spiral Group, this kind of consortium of African-American artists, was in fact located on Christopher Street. That's right next to St. Veronica's Church. You can just see over there. Next, please. Frank Stella. So kind of getting into a little bit of a later era. Frank, of course, is very much still with us. We were incredibly pleased to be able to do a program with him where we put a plaque on this building, and he joined us for the unveiling of the plaque. And this is another great artist home that was threatened with demolition. We had a 6-year campaign, I believe it took, to save it from demolition. In the 1940s, before Frank Stella moved in, it housed an assembly line training center for women during World War II. So we appropriated the Rosie the Riveter image as part of our campaign to save the building, which we're about to say we were able to do. Next, please. Diane Arbus, who also lived all over our neighborhoods on Washington Place. Next. She also lived in the Redwood Triangle in the East Village at 120 East 10th Street. She, of course, lived in the rear house at 131 Charles, and then finally at Westbeth for not very long after it opened in 1970. If you go to the next slide, you can see some of the images that she took, which were taken in our neighborhood, mostly in and around Washington Square Park, although the young couple in the upper left, I believe that's on Hudson Street. Next, please. And we have next door neighbors on Bond Street, Chuck Close and Robert Mapplethorpe. NoHo, of course, became a great center of artistic activity in the 1970s into the 1980s. Next, please. Keith Haring, whose studios were at 676 Broadway, also in NoHo, which is now where the Haring Foundation is located. And next we have his of course, wonderful artwork, which the public gets to enjoy on the Carmine Street Recreation Center. Next, please. Jean-Michel Basquiat, who lived and worked in this former stable on Great Jones Street, owned by his friend Andy Warhol. Here as well, we were able to place a plaque there a couple of years ago. And if you go to the next slide, again, not only were these artists located here, but they were inspired by things they saw around them. This painting on the right, Defacement, is about the killing of Michael Stewart by the police, which took place in the 14th Street and First Avenue subway station, which Basquiat was greatly affected by. He knew Stewart. They traveled in the same circles. They were roughly the same age. Like him, he was an East Village artist, and he was reported to have said this to many people, it could have been me. Again, drawing on both the events and of his surroundings. Next, please. And then we have the former Yiddish Art Theater, now the Village East, and it still has apartments, if I'm not mistaken, on the upper floor. And in the 1970s and 80s, it was again one of these sort of little artist colonies. David Wojnarowicz, Peter Hujar, and Jackie Curtis all lived there around the same time in the 1970s and 1980s. Next, please. And, again, this could be not only its own program, but its own series of programs. The 1980s East Village art scene, where really there was an unprecedented concentration of galleries and the emergence of new artists at the time. There's no way to get into all of that in this program, but I just want to acknowledge it. And then finally, just in what I think is an interesting case of strange bedfellows, these buildings at 307 West 11th Street, Jack Kerouac had lived there in the 1950s. Then in the early 2000s, Annie Leibovitz lived there. This might be a slightly generous term. She actually almost destroyed the houses, but they were her residents for a while. So in a variety of different ways, the neighborhood continues to attract artistic types, and that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions or hear from any of you. I think we also have it's set up so that the folks who
you get any questions.
Okay, so if there are any questions from the
You talked about things with did that become clients? You're not the clients?
Yes, so the Astor Library is being clients, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. So it's set up to help immigrants. It still exists. They're very much out there. It's a wonderful entity. And of course, it was saved from demolition by being turned into the local theater. Anybody else?
Tell us about a building that's at risk now that village preservation is leading either to not to be torn down.
Well, that's a wonderful question, and there's a lot of them. But what I'll do with, I'm not going to go through all of them. But one of the areas is those of you who follow the work that we do know that we're very, very focused on these days is the area south of Union Square. Actually, Leanne, if I can ask you to scroll up to that image again with the all of the names of the. Okay, they're perfect. So this area south of Union Square, which is it okay if I walk over this? So basically, all of this here in Greenwich Village, for the most part, is landmark, and a lot of the East Village over here, NoHo was mostly landmarks. A lot of the East Village. Some of it is landmarks. Most of it is zoned in such a way that it doesn't really incentivize the demolition of buildings. However, this area, basically south of Union Square, from 5th Avenue to 3rd Avenue, along 14th, 13th, 12th, 11th, 10th, and 9th Streets. That area has terrible zoning that encourages the demolition of buildings. That's why that's where the Frank Stella building is that we have safe from demolition. That's where the 827, 831 building that Will de Kooning had his studios in was slated for being replaced with a 300-foot tall tower. But if you could scroll through until you get to the two Roberts, Robert Motherwell and Robert Indiana. So those are examples of buildings that are extant, that are in this area that is actually stop and go back one. So this building is in that south of Union Square area. It could be demolished at any time. Go next, keep going. So there it is again. Another one in these areas. Keep going. Go back. Sorry, did you build it? Yes. So this 799 Broadway, the old St. Denis, that's in this south of Union Square area that we're trying to get landmarked, and it was demolished because it doesn't enjoy landmark protections, but does have this terrible zoning. So next, keep going. Oh, go back. So all of these, Selma Hortensburg, Yunji, this house here, and now just slowly scroll forward. Keep going, not patch in place. That's okay. These are all safe. Keep going. This one, go back. 49 East 10th, and the next 61 4th Avenue, both Robert Indiana and Robert Motherwell. You can pause there. All in this sort of south of Union Square area that we're trying to get landmarked. So any of those buildings could be demolished at any time, and all of this incredible history connected to it could be lost. So if you're interested in helping and having ready, go to our website, and we have an automated letter set up where you can quickly send something to the appropriate elected official saying, this area is important. It merits landmark designation, and I support it being landmarked. And of course, you can always make a donation. Thank you very much to support our work. If you're not so much a letter writer, although if you're old, we certainly love that too. But thank you for that question, Jean. Yes, unfortunately, not all of these buildings, in spite of their historic significance, are necessarily safe. That may the next time I make this presentation, I can be showing you a picture of what used to be there, as opposed to what is there. If we're not able to do this. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much.